Yeah, sure. You can put it in the corner there. Thank you, Romana. Thank you.
Have you enjoyed your trip so far?
Well,
Has
I
it
mean, if
been-
I didn't have to give all the interviews, maybe I might have.
Well, I see, that's the thing. I've heard you answer lots of the same questions over and over and
Yeah.
over again. Everybody
Yeah.
seems to ask you, like, why you're doing it and what the motivation is for
Yeah,
why
I
you're
mean-
doing it, and whether you ever get scared, or whether... And do you get bored of answering the same questions?
Sometimes I wish I could say, for the same reason that you do your job. Honestly, yeah, because it's like, yeah, why do you do your job? When we talk poverty in Africa, it's a completely different level of poverty altogether, because when you talk poverty, you're not talking about having your basic amenities that you have here. You know, I mean, the slums are slums. You know, there's no plumbing to talk about. There's raw sewage everywhere. There's overcrowding, and there's basically no food. And so that's the kind of poverty that people wouldn't even dream exists. And even in Zimbabwe, those of us who live in the in the northern suburbs and don't know what's happening in the townships get shocked by it. And it's the kind of poverty where if you gave $2 a day, it would make a huge difference for somebody. And more often than not, the people who are in that really poor state, if you gave them $500 to start a project, an income generation project, it would make a huge difference to them. And because African society is very extended, that $500 would probably stretch to cover, you know, a whole lot more than just your nuclear family. And we're talking here where people don't have just one basic meal a day, which will be nutritious. You know, it's bad. And I feel very guilty because what we do in Zimbabwe, for instance, we are so obsessed with the socio-political, rights more than the economic rights. And because, firstly, I mean, who's going to listen to you when you go and say the state must provide basics that are economic when the persons are not even enjoying the other rights? So trying to balance the two is impossible. And it would be great if somebody could specifically look at those rights. And Zimbabweans are very, very hardworking people. If somebody enabled them to just have some of those basic living standards, it would probably make a huge difference. I once spoke to somebody, I think this was in Canada a couple of years ago, where we were exploring whether we could find some sort of like women's bank, because women are very industrious. I'm not saying this because I'm a woman. And small seed money would make a huge difference as loans, and they would pay it back, and just to, you know, make sure that they start things with which they can feed their families.
So, I mean, I suppose then, do you think that the barrier to that is the finance in the first instance, or do you think that it is about securing people's rights? Because is there any, without security of those people's basic rights, is securing their economic rights, is that just a fragile thing that could be taken away from them, I suppose?
It is a fragile thing, but I mean, when you look at it from the other perspective, is what's the point of ensuring that somebody doesn't go to jail if when they're out of jail they won't even have that 1 meal a day, whereas if they're in jail they might have 1 meal a day? There are those contradictions of, you know, yeah, sure, you got me out of jail, so what? How am I going to live after that? So, you know, depending on the person's circumstances, it actually can be a double-edged sword, where somebody might have been fed in prison and you get them out of prison and they have no food outside prison. And there must be a way of finding some form of balance. For instance, just talking about prison. I mean, when I was in jail, what struck me is that other than working in the fields for what they consume, the women have no income generating projects in prison. And yet they could do a whole lot of things. I mean, at the male prison, the men have access to furthering their education. They can do carpentry, this and that. The women don't even have a room where they can learn basic skills like sewing skills, like, you know, there isn't that. And why is that not there? They go out to work in the fields, to tend the vegetables that they will consume with their meals, and after that there's nothing else. And yet actually they could, you know, make a living which would even improve their nutrition. For instance, they can have a poultry project where they keep chickens and they can have meat. I mean, the whole 8 days when I was in prison, all they eat is the basic staple maize, you know, porridge with a green vegetable. Not once was there meat. And yet they can actually have a poultry project where they raise chickens, they can sell those, and everybody can get a little money when they leave prison, you know. And it's not an expensive project. It can easily be done. They have all the time in the world. And it means that when they leave prison, they might have acquired the skill of raising chickens, and they can do it when they go out, particularly if they're able to go out with a bit of money from prison when they've been there. So you find that really we keep people in prison, and they come out of prison, they're worse off than they went in, because they're coming back with absolutely nothing.
I mean, do you see, when you like represent somebody from Women of Zimbabwe Arise, do you see that your representation of them is like your contribution to what they're doing in terms of calling for, you know, basic things like water and education for their children, or do you just sort of see it as representing another client who is...
No. In fact, when you watch the documentary, you see Jenny. I try as much as possible to get the judicial officer to see that these women are asking for things that we all aspire to. They're not just another client, you know. When she says, I bring their demonstration and their issues into the courtroom, I truly try to make the person trying them see that this cannot be a crime at all, and they're just not another client. They are asking for basic things that ought not to be criminalized. And for me, the women of Zimbabwe Arise are not just another client. They are women asking for what we all want. And I try, therefore, to look even beyond just what they're advocating for. Because, you know, the story that is not told is that a lot of them have had their families break up because of their activism. I've had quite a few of them where they go back home and the husband says, go back where you are coming from. I don't have a wife who's going to be in jail for 5 days. And those are the personal stories that never really even get out to the public domain. You know, you don't only risk being arrested, you risk having your marriage collapse because of your activism. And a person like that can't just be another client.
I mean, it's interesting. You were speaking yesterday when you were asked about the Millennium Development Goals. There was, you know, the Millennium Development Goals cover lots of the same issues that that WOZA are kind of are fighting for. Lots of the same provisions that they want to secure. But you were sort of saying yesterday that it's just a piece of paper.
For the government,
yes, it is. I mean, do you see any advantage in sort of those international instruments Do you see that they have a role at all? Or?
You see, there's nothing wrong in aspiring to have those goals and in having some form of sanction if you don't meet them. I mean, if there was something that was done to make sure that, you know, the politicians stick to what has been agreed to. But I mean, most of these guys, even a whole lot of the treaties, this and that, they'll happily sign, but they really don't care about the implementation. So for me, it's like, what are we doing to implement what we have agreed to? Yeah, you do have those goals. Have you done anything at all to try and attain even just a quarter of them? And what have you done? Yes, you'll always say the money is a restriction. Of course, money is a restriction, but I mean, why is it that the restrictions are when it comes to delivering to the people and not to having bloated international delegations to every useless meeting in the world and spending millions of dollars on having 70 people fly out to New York for some UN meeting, and you, whatever you agree to, you get back home, nobody even remembers what you were going. If that money was being applied to really empower people and to meet what you would have agreed to, say in the MDGs, that would be useful. But we don't have politicians like that, unfortunately.
So, I mean, do you think that that when you commit to something like that, when you put your name to something like that, then that should be like a commitment to the people?
Yes.
At the moment, it seems like it's a commitment to the international community, whereas it should actually be a commitment to your own people.
Yeah. But, I mean, it's worse than that, because even your commitment to the international community, nobody holds you to that commitment. It's the international community is happy that you signed. They'll tell you, oh, we have 52 states that have signed this, you know. How many are implementing? You never hear about that, you know. Of the ones who have ratified and they've agreed to that particular, you know, agreement, how many are implementing? Nobody ever follows up on that, you know. And the next time around you have a meeting where loads and loads of money is spent, and the politicians go there, they enjoy. I mean, we had the African Union a few weeks ago celebrating 50 years, spending millions of dollars on those celebrations. What do you think could have been done if they had said, we're just going to have a regular African Union meeting, the celebration money we will use to do this particular project, and we call it our 50th anniversary project? You know, can you imagine the impact of that? But no, they don't do that.
We're currently consulting lawyers on, on what they want this framework to look like, what they want to come after the MDGs. And as one of the questioners said yesterday, you know, world leaders have identified rule of law as one of the things that's a priority. But, you know, rule of law is open to interpretation as a concept. And I suppose I want to know if you see residual human rights as a fundamental element of the rule of law, even if human rights aren't protected explicitly in the law. So if Zimbabwe next week actually got rid of its Bill of Rights, would you see residual human rights as being a fundamental part of the rule of law without it being written down, without it actually being held on the statute?
Yeah, it really ought not to be written down, because, I mean, the Christian saying that you do unto others like you'd like done to yourself ought to apply across the board. I mean, if our politicians truly cared about their people, we wouldn't need to write down all of these things, because we ought to apply them. It's just part of our humanity, you know. As human beings, we have the capacity to see right from wrong and to do with each other, you know, what is right. And so, yes, my view is that we really do not need the pieces of paper. But the pieces of paper help in trying to hold people to a certain standard. And we have those pieces of paper because of our frailty as human beings. We have these failings that require us to put things on paper so that we're able to hold each other to that piece of paper. It's like a marriage certificate, I guess, in a way. You know, you don't need really to be married to commit to each other, but you'll have that piece of paper to say, hey, you're married to me, you know, you can't treat me like this. But in the normal course, we really ought not to have that.
And do you see that then as being kind of, do you see that as being a developing country issue, or do you see that as being, and rule of law as being a development country issue, or do you see it just as being a kind of whole world issue, actually? That,
I mean, when we look at rule of law, we look at it from different perspectives, because in the developing world, some of the rule of law issues that people might come up with are completely different from what, you know, in the developing world will put emphasis on, simply because your state of development is at a separate and different stage, you know. So some aspects of it, yes, might have international application, but others will be more developmental issues, really, because if you're concerned about people's economic status, that will apply to the developing world more than it would. If you talk of basic rights, for instance, or, you know, the right to free trial, or in the developing world, you can rush to court knowing that that's not going to be looked at from any other perspective than that it's a basic right that really ought not to raise any argument. But when you go to our compromised judiciaries, it will be a different story altogether. So, I mean, we battle with different aspects of the rule of law depending on our level of development.
You know, lots of our readers and lots of the people who will watch the video are going to be people who work in the City of London as lawyers, and it's this age-old question of, is there anything that they can actually do specifically in terms of using their legal skills to help the struggle for justice in Zimbabwe?
Oof, it's always a bit difficult to really answer and say that, but I mean, specifically with this group, I think because we have so many organizations that deal with rule of law issues, that look at the more the socio-political issues, we could have an organization such as yours look at the economic issues. You know, what sort of blueprint can we have to use lawyers in Zimbabwe to empower the people economically? You know, as lawyers, can we set up an NGO that will specifically look at economic issues in Zimbabwe, particularly for the person, the downtrodden person down there? Because as lawyers, we should really use our different capacities and our different skills to empower holistically the entire human person. I mean, you could look at how do we look after prisoners, you know, particularly the female prisoners, for instance. You know, what can we set up in Zimbabwe with our colleagues there that can make sure that the women come out of prison with some skills, or with you know, they use that time profitably and to look after themselves, to avoid them going back into jail in the first instance. And for me, that would be a very powerful tool in that we have lawyers not just looking at keeping women out of jail when they've transgressed, but empowering them to be better people when they come out and they go out back into their communities as useful members of society. I mean, for me, that would be fantastic. I truly would like something like that. When I was in prison, you know, the women there have some of their children living with them. There was a foreign woman from the Congo who was in the prison with 3 of her children, 2 little girls of between 8 and 6 and a 4-year-old boy, were living with the women in prison, who were not going to school, it's a scandal. If it shouldn't be difficult to really have those children go to school properly, and to have their mothers, held perhaps separately, even just building a separate little complex that will be like, okay, if the kids have to be here, at the very least, there's a separate complex where they are with their mothers, and you try to imitate a normal family life as much as possible. That kind of thing. For me, it would make a huge difference. So it would be fantastic if an organization like AI did something like that.
I think it's actually a really interesting idea of that sort of what you were saying earlier on, that you can't just get somebody, you can't just help them get out of prison.
Yes,
it's what happens
absolutely.
next.
Yeah, what happens next?
You still have a responsibility in a sense. The only last point, I suppose, is the one of the upcoming elections, and I wonder if you could just, if there's anything that you can say about, do you have any hope that out of these elections there will be a change? Or, do you think that the change in politics has to precede the change in the law? Do you think you need different politics in Zimbabwe before you get the rule of law back? And do you think that the coming elections could be the opportunity to get that change?
I very definitely believe that the political will has to be there first and foremost before we can have the rule of law restored in Zimbabwe. Yeah. So certainly I hope that with each election that we have, we'll have leaders who will really have the desire to have a functioning legal system that respects the rule of law completely.